Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Plummer. In this episode, we talk with John Stigall about Omissions and Frankfurt cases. John defends the view that while we can be morally responsible for performing positive actions even if we lack the ability to do otherwise, moral responsibility for omissions requires the ability to do otherwise.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce John Stigall, who's currently a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Morgan State University. John's areas of specialization are metaphysics, ethics, and agency and responsibility, and he's collaborated on an experimental philosophy paper published in Philosophical Psychology, which we'll link in the show notes. John recently received his PhD in philosophy from Florida State University, where he wrote a dissertation on Omissions and Frankfurt cases, which is the topic of today's episode. So welcome to the show, John. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Thank you so much, Taylor and Matt. And before I start, let me just thank you all for inviting me to the Free Will Show. This is my first Free Will podcast. It's also my first philosophy podcast. It's my first podcast altogether. So very excited to talk to you all about moral responsibility, free will, and omissions. I'll say a bit about myself. As Taylor mentioned, my name is John Stigall. I'm a lecturer of philosophy at Morgan State University. That's a historically Black university in Baltimore, Maryland. Has a fantastic pluralistic philosophy and religious studies department. It's the kind of place where you can learn about Hegel, Angela Davis, Baldwin, and you might learn about Gettier cases too. A lot of different traditions are represented over at Morgan State. As far as how I became interested in issues related to free will, that's funny. I like that question so much because I actually know the exact time in which I became interested in the topic.
Nice.
I know when I wasn't interested in it, and I also know when I became interested in it. Essentially, during my senior year of undergrad, I was at this undergraduate conference, and I was presenting some of my research, and it was research on the analysis of causation. I had this whole theory of causation set up, and obviously I'll be embarrassed about any of the things that I said back then, but that's not the point. The point is that the keynote speaker at that conference was another guest of the Free Will Show, Michael McKenna. Mm-hmm. And you have to understand at that time, I don't know anything about the free will literature. I'm just happy to talk to people about philosophy without them getting annoyed and wanting to talk about something else. So if I'm talking to someone about philosophy, I tend to be pretty happy. So in any case, I'm talking to Michael McKenna after the conference is over, and I'm telling him how obvious it is that free will requires the ability to do otherwise. Unbeknownst to me, Michael McKenna is a prominent philosopher who works on this kind of thing. And the idea that free will doesn't require the ability to do otherwise is kind of one of his whole things. So he told me, well, what if this happens? And he describes this special sort of hypothetical scenario. And he told me it's called a Frankfurt case. And ever since then, I've been interested in free will, moral responsibility. And I also retain that interest in causation that I brought with me from before. So I ended up doing a dissertation at Florida State, a lot of it having to do with Frankfurt-style cases, specifically having to do with omissions. And I also learned a ton from my dissertation advisor, Randolph Clark, as well as my dissertation committee. But the main thing is I've been interested in causation, free will, moral responsibility, in connection with the omissions for quite a long time since then.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool. So as you mentioned, your dissertation's focused on omissions, and one issue that you address is Frankfurt cases involving omissions. But before we ask about that, could you explain what an omission is and why we should care about whether we as agents ever freely omit?
All right, that's a good question. An omission essentially is a failure to act. Another way of saying is that omission is when an agent does not perform an action. I'll say a few things about why I think we should care about omissions, and I'll say a few things about what we might want to take omissions to be. So let's start with why we should care. Well, I would invite you to consider how much morally, socially, and legally significant human behavior of agents involves not acting. A caretaker could fail in their duty so much that we consider it negligent. In law, we might make a distinction between failing to perform some illegal action and succeeding in performing that action. In fact, it seems that trying and failing to perform an illegal action is something illegal in itself. A lot of activism involves omissions. Nonviolent resistance is characterized by not using violence in opposition to some form of injustice. Worker strikes involve omitting the work. Boycotts involve refraining from using particular products. And I think that if you want to think seriously about these sort of things, I wouldn't say that it's totally required to comb through all the literature on free will and omissions, but I do think it can be beneficial to take some time to think about what omissions are and how we might be responsible for them. So what about these things that we should think about, that we should care about? What should we say about these things, and are they even things? I think there's three directions that you could go in. Omissions could be three things, and I guess I'm using the term things pretty loosely. They could be nothing special, something special, or they could be nothing at all. All right. So on a reductive account of omissions, omissions are nothing special. So if you're going within a reductive account, you could identify the omission with whatever it is that the agent is doing instead. All right. So let's say you are my neighbor and you ask me to check your mail while you're out of town. You tell me, John, I need you to check my mail while I'm out of town. I'm expecting a lot of mail, and the mailbox is going to fill up if you don't check that mail. And I look at you and I don't seem all that interested. And I say, oh, sure, don't worry about it. I'll check the mail. And then I don't do it, right? On a reductive account, whatever it was that I was doing instead, maybe I'm watching a new Matrix movie. Maybe I'm trying out new recipes. I'm hanging out with my friends. That would be the omission on the reductive kind of account. The realist goes in another direction, and they say that omissions are something special. So for the realist, the omissions are going to be their own kind of thing, a sui generis kind of entity. There's a special thing that's called an omission that's different from other kinds of actions. An omission might even be a negative action. So when failing to check your mail, I'm performing some kind of action that has some kind of negative characteristic associated with it. Now, according to what I call an eliminative account, omissions are nothing at all. So more carefully, there's no thing that is an omission. So you might say that it seems strange to think that there has to be some kind of thing that exists in form and virtue of an agent not acting. And that might motivate kind of taking this eliminative approach towards omissions. And I should also say that you don't have to say the same thing about every instance. You might look at one instance of an omission and say, well, that looks like something special. You might look at another example and say, that looks like nothing at all. And you can say different things about different kinds of cases. Mm-hmm. So nothing special, something special, or nothing at all.
Yeah, cool.
Do you have a preferred view? Do you endorse one of those views?
Do I endorse one of those views? I do. I don't endorse it explicitly in my dissertation, but I'm very inclined towards the idea that there isn't such thing as omissions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Cool. Well, we interviewed Carolina Sartorio about Frankfurt cases in the first season of the podcast, but we focused entirely on Frankfurt cases in which the agent performs an action, like the mental act of making a decision, and then seems morally responsible despite lacking the ability to do otherwise than to perform that action. Could you describe, just so that it's fresh for our listeners, one of those action type Frankfurt cases, and then introduce an omission type Frankfurt case?
Right. Speaking of causation and free will, causation and responsibility, I should mention that she was not at Florida State when I was there, but I also learned a great deal from Carolina Sartorio. I used to bother her with emails, and she always answered my goofy little questions, and I was very grateful for that.
Awesome.
So in any case, the Frankfurt case is this kind of example that I alluded to before that I learned from Michael McKenna. And I think there's lots of lessons that you might want to take from those cases, but I think that at its core, a Frankfurt-style case is a special sort of example that's supposed to show that an agent can be responsible for something or can freely do something or fail to do so. We got to come back to that. Even if the agent lacks the ability to do otherwise. All right. So here's an example. Suppose I'm deliberating about performing some action of moral significance. Let's say it's checking your mail after all. Also suppose that I understand what I'm doing. I'm acting intentionally. And I have as many of the characteristics that you want to associate with freely acting or acting responsibly. Well, except for one, but we have to come back to that. It seems like I acted freely in checking your mail. But let's add something to that example. Let's suppose that unbeknownst to me, my other neighbor is standing by and is prepared to ensure that I check that mail regardless, right? So, whatever reason, my neighbor is prepared to ensure that I check this mail one way or the other, and they're going to be successful in doing so if they need to, if it comes to that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe they bullied me until I check the mail, and I wouldn't be able to resist their bullying. But the more common kind of example in the literature involves the neighbor maybe being a nefarious neuroscientist that has some kind of technology hooked up to my brain that they're prepared to activate. It starts to look like I'm not going to check the mail. But even so, there are would-be intervener. They never needed to get involved because I checked that mail on my own. In a case like that, one could argue that I was responsible for checking the mail. I acted freely in checking the mail, but I was unable to do otherwise than check the mail. Now, philosophers have been keen to distinguish this kind of case from another kind of case, and I'll talk about some of the ways you can modify this case later. But for now, just suppose that I'm supposed to check your mail by the end of the day, just like before, but this time I never leave my house, right? But unbeknownst to me, all the exits to my house are locked. I left my phone in the car, my internet's disconnected, and there's no way for me to make it to the mailbox by the end of the day. Now, this case has a structure that resembles Frankfurt-style cases. Is it a Frankfurt case? Maybe, maybe not. But it does have a lot of the characteristics that you do associate with those cases. I don't check your mail. I know what I'm not doing. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't have been able to do it anyway. And if a case like that, it becomes a lot harder to say that I acted freely in failing to check your mail. And it becomes hard to say that I'm responsible for failing to check your mail. And that kind of comparison can be used to motivate this idea that moral responsibility for ordinary actions or free actions do not require the ability to do otherwise, but responsibility for omissions / freely omitting does require the ability to act, which would indicate a certain kind of asymmetry between actions and omissions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. So, in your view, is it possible to provide a theoretical basis for this intuitive asymmetry between action type and omission type Frankfurt cases? And could you also briefly describe what you think is involved in an action type Frankfurt case in virtue of which the agent is free and responsible despite lacking alternatives?
All right, so that's an excellent question. And I think there is a theoretical basis for this intuitive asymmetry. And for me, it links up a great deal with philosophical questions about causation and how causation relates to freedom and responsibility. So how do we link freedom and responsibility with causation? One thought is that if an agent is responsible for something, and I'm using the term something pretty loosely, then the agent needs to have some kind of causal relationship with that thing. If I did check your mail, there needs to be some kind of causal relationship between me, what I decided to do, what I ended up doing, and whatever ended up happening. It seems right to say that my action is causally relevant to that sequence of events. On the other hand, if I'm wholly causally irrelevant to your mail getting checked, if someone else checked it and I wasn't even in town, then it seems wrong to say that I would be responsible for checking your mail. Moral responsibility seems to require a certain kind of causal relationship. But hold on a second, it can't be any old causal relationship, right? Because when you look at any event and you try to figure out what its causes are, you very often find a ton of them, right? Mm-hmm. If I failed to check your mail in the ordinary case and that mailbox starts filling up, only some of those causes stand out to us. And I'm not just appealing to intuition there. There's some evidence that people tend to do this. And if you find that in the experimental philosophy, the empirical philosophy on the empirical literature on the philosophy of causation, you find this kind of result. They might stand out to us for whatever reason. So consider that the size of the mailbox, right? You might think about that as being a cause of the mailbox being filled up. But the mailbox was bigger, it wouldn't have filled up. You might think about the mail carrier putting mail into the mailbox. That's also a cause of the mailbox filling up. That doesn't stand out as much as my failure to check the mail. The presence of oxygen in our environment, right? Yeah. That seems to count as a cause because, well, think, if there wasn't any oxygen in the environment, nobody's going to fill that mailbox up. So there's all kinds of causes that you could pick on. You could pick out. You could pick on and pick out, right? But only some of them stand out. And when they stand out in that way, we call them salient. And if they stand out for moral reasons, I like to call them morally salient. So when we look at these Frankfurt style cases, I think what happens is that you find a morally salient causal relationship between the agent and whatever it is, right? And that morally salient causal relationship does not require the ability to do otherwise. Someone or something was standing by prepared to intervene, but that causal relationship still remains.
Interesting. So now that we've unpacked the idea of a morally salient causal relationship a little bit, can you explain why such a relationship is absent in the omission type case?
Sure. And to make sense out of this, we do need to say a little bit about causation. And the basic idea is that there's these two major trends in the causation literature about what exactly it takes for causation to happen. And let's say we call them the cause C and we're causing an effect E. Essentially, one tendency is to take C's causing E to be a matter of C making a difference to whether E happens. All right. So on a very general idea, on a very general level, the idea would be that if C didn't happen, E wouldn't have happened. In other words, E depends on C. And as you might imagine, there's lots of ways of characterizing that. You can get pretty fancy with this. There are these special equations that you can use to characterize this. They call them structural equations. You would also figure this out in terms of possible worlds. But the basic idea is that causation involves a certain amount of difference making, a certain sort of difference making. Another trend is to take causation to involve some kind of connection between the cause and the effect. So if C causes E on this other picture, C needs to be connected to E, all right? So causation might be physical connection, and physical connection might be characterized by looking at our physical theories and looking at how conserved quantities work. It could be a certain type of intrinsic relatedness, or maybe it has to do with powers or dispositions. But one way of kind of characterizing this to make it a little bit more vibrant and a little bit clearer is that David Lewis used to use this term BIFF to describe this kind of causation. And the idea is basically, if you remember Adam West Batman, Biff, pow, zap, boom, right? You're talking about causation having kind of this connective force associated with it. So there are these two kind of tendencies in the causation literature. But here's the deal. Connection style causation is hostile to omissions, all right? And dependent style causation is a lot more friendly to omissions. And let me try to explain pretty quickly some of the reasons why. So let's start with connection. Let's say you try to say that omissions are nothing special, and you try to identify it with an ordinary action. You can come up with some interesting puzzles about the locations of the omissions. Suppose I don't check your mail and I fly to the other side of the world, right? Well, the omission is located where I am. The mailbox is filling up on the other side of the planet. And you would actually need faster than light causal transmission to make that causal connection, right? If you think omissions are nothing at all, then you might have causation, but no causes and effects, right? Because causes and effects are presumably something. If you think causation involves that kind of relation, you would have a relation without relata, without things being related.
Yeah.
And if you think that omissions are something special, you might have a bit of an interaction problem. Well, omissions are something different from the other stuff that we're accustomed to in the world. And how does that something different interact with the other things that we're more accustomed to, right?
Right.
So for connection, you do have some problems with omissions, but with dependence, not nearly as bad. If I checked your mail, the mailbox wouldn't have filled up, right? That counterfactual can be true, and it can be true no matter what we say about omissions, right? It's just pretty clear that counterfactual is true, and it's much easier to find this dependence kind of relationship when we're talking about omissions. Now, for omissions to causally link up to things, I think it needs to be in terms of dependence, right? Because omissions are a lot more friendly to dependence. And for ordinary actions to causally link up to things, it doesn't seem to require dependence. Connection seems to do the job pretty well. And that's why I think the Frankfurt style cases work better when they involve ordinary positive actions. and they don't work as well when they involve omissions. And the reason for this is that this would-be intervener who ensures that things play out exactly as they do is dependence undermining. And what I mean by that is that the would-be intervener ensures that whatever it is that happens does not depend upon the agent. The agent is unable to make a difference because of the presence of the would-be intervener. And omissions, if they're going to figure into causal relationships, they need to do so by means of some kind of dependence. Frankfurt-style cases remove that dependence. And since they do remove that dependence, I think they're not going to be as successful as the ordinary action-style Frankfurt-style cases.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so we've gone over this asymmetry thesis where Frankfurt cases seem to show that we need alternative possibilities are not necessary for actions, but they don't show that alternative possibilities are not necessary for omissions. What are some potential challenges? Like, what are the objections that you find really, really interesting and have a hard time with, and how would you respond to these objections?
So there are some good objections out there, and I try to respond to them. One of them comes from the Free Will Show's own Taylor Sear, and another comes from Philip Swenson. Okay, so there are two I can pick out. So Philip Swenson has this really interesting paper in Philosophical Studies where he argues, based on some examples a lot like the ones that we're talking about now, that there's no principal difference between Frankfurt-style cases involving omissions and Frankfurt-style cases involving ordinary positive actions. And he argues based on a comparison of cases a lot like the ones that we've been talking about today. Mm-hmm. So we'll start with the case where I'm locked in my house, right? So you could have that case and it looks like I'm not responsible. So just grant that as a premise. Everything's locked down. I never leave the house, and I never find out that I'm locked into the house because I don't even try to leave my house, right? Now, suppose you modified that case a little bit, right? And you said, well, maybe there's some sensors set up in the house, right? If I get close enough to an exit, everything locks down, right? Mm-hmm. But once again, I never find out that these sensors are in place because I never try to leave the house to begin with, right? So Swenson thinks, well, if you're not responsible in the first case, you're also not responsible in the second case. Now, what if we made the example a lot more like the Frankfurt case that I talked about in the beginning with the nefarious neuroscientist neighbor? That's alliteration, and I did not realize that until now. So you have the nefarious neuroscientist neighbor. They have some technology hooked up into your brain. If it starts to look like I'm going to go check that mail, they ensure that I don't do it. In a case like that, well, Philip Swenson thinks I should say the same thing about that case as I do about the case with the sensor. But if I say the same thing about those two cases, that second case with the nefarious neuroscientist neighbor seems to look pretty similar when it involves an ordinary positive action.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's no real difference between the four cases. And I guess there's two ways of characterizing my response to that. One thing I would say is that one simple way of saying this is I guess I just reject that last step. But another way of looking at it is that I think I just look at it from a different kind of perspective. I guess I have this test, right, that you use for figuring out if an agent has a certain kind of causal relevance to whatever it is that ends up happening. And the order in which the cases are presented doesn't really have any play any role in the way in which I have to, judge the success or the failure of the cases. So I guess this difference in causal relevance characterizes that principal difference that Swenson claims you're not going to be able to find in those between those cases. Now I know that he has some individual replies to a lot of cases as well. But I think that there is a principal difference. Taylor, I think has one, he discusses the no principal difference objection in his own paper. What's the name of the paper, Taylor?
Oh, shoot. You put me on the spot.
I'm sorry. I was...
Semi-compatibilism. It's a very wordy title: semi-compatibilism and
That's
moral
why I was.
responsibility for actions and omissions in defense of symmetry, or something like that.
I found it. Semi-compatibilism and moral responsibility for actions and omissions, in dispense of symmetrical requirements. So there were two things in that paper I thought were pretty interesting. You consider the possibility of keeping things symmetrical, but instead saying that the agent is responsible for all the cases.
Right.
And you also motivate this idea of maintaining symmetry by considering the possibility that, well, if you go asymmetrical and determinism ends up being true, determinism being this idea that if you take the state of the universe at some point in the past and it tells every other state of the universe afterwards, since it rules out alternative possibilities across the board, at least that don't involve violations of the laws of nature or change in the past or something like that, then there might be a difference between how determinism influences ordinary positive actions and how it influences omissions, which would be kind of strange. How could I be responsible for positive actions but not omissions if determinism ends up being true, right? As far as the first one, I think there's a principal difference. So I'm using that test of causal relevance to judge the cases. So I think there's a principal difference, and I don't want to make a distinction between the cases based on directly applying intuitions. Mm-hmm. And as far as determinism being true, I think it may very well turn out that you're not responsible for certain kinds of omissions, but some consolation might be that you end up being responsible for some other kinds of things instead. You could be responsible for whatever it is that you did instead, even if that other thing that you did instead doesn't turn out to be an omission. So you get to keep a lot of your responsibility, but there might be a little segment that you lose if determinism ends up being the case, ends up being true.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, maybe the worry about determinism and this sort of odd implication about it ruling out, responsibility for omissions, but not actions, given some certain other commitments that a semi-compatibilist or sort of compatibilist might have. Maybe it will only really be compelling with certain views of what omissions are. Like maybe the more realist you are about omissions, the more troubling that would be, or something like that. I'll have to think more about that, though.
I will too. That does sound interesting. And I should say that I think that your views about what omissions are, they cut across a lot of these debates, and you can end up going in a lot of different places. And as a matter of fact, I think we say something similar about the case where the omission ends up being identical to an action. Suppose you look at a particular case and you think omission might be identical to an action in this particular case. Well, maybe the Frankfurt style cases might work a lot better in a case like that. So I'm inclined to accept that kind of thing. But I think generally there's a lot of hostility between omissions and this kind of connective causation. And there's a lot more friendliness between omissions and causation as this kind of difference making.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I think it's also worth mentioning that omissions can be characterized in sort of broad and narrow ways, all right? So under the broad characterization of omissions, whenever an agent doesn't do something, whenever an agent doesn't act, that counts as an omission. Why might you be troubled by this idea of a broad conception? Well, consider that I'm not running at 50 miles per hour right now. Now, I was going to say we're on the phone, so you have to take my word for it. But you all can see me, so you can tell that I'm not running at 50 miles per hour right now. But the idea would be, okay, I can't run at 50 miles per hour. Nobody's expecting me to run at 50 miles per hour. It would be weird to say that I'm failing to run at 50 miles per hour right now. So you might want to restrict your conception of omissions, restrict your characterization, and narrow things a little bit. You might say that whenever I'm able to do it, then that counts as an omission and I don't do it. Or if I'm supposed to do it and I fail to do it, that counts as an omission. Or if I'm expected to perform in some way and I don't, then that counts as an omission. But that difference between broad and narrow conceptions also has some significance in the literature on moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So in that distinction between broad and narrow, is it really about whether it counts as an omission or whether we care about whether like these omissions? Because like you said, there's all kind of stuff that we're omitting right now. And it seems like there are omissions because I'm not drinking my water not calling somebody on the phone, but we don't really care about that at this moment because maybe it's context dependent or whatever. And does that question make sense?
I think that's very much a thing. But I guess, yeah, my thinking would be essentially that, well, if you go with the broad characterization, there's just a bunch of omissions out there.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to if you look at some event, there's a bunch of causes out there, right? And we care about some of them, we don't care about others, right? And that can shift depending on context, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you might want to take those norms of selection a little bit more seriously. And if you're inclined to take those norms of selection more seriously, you might want to go all the way and say, well, some of these cases don't really count as omissions. So I guess it would have a lot to do with how seriously you take those norms of selection. That's the way I would think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does seem like if I fail to water my plant and it dies, like my omission was relevant in a way that the Queen of England's not watering my plant wasn't really relevant, even though had the Queen of England watered my plant, it still wouldn't have died.
Yeah.
So I think that overlaps very significantly with this idea about norms of selection. You do end up with a lot of profligacy when you start appealing to those kinds of counterexamples. If Godzilla had attacked my apartment complex, I wouldn't have had this interview, but it's Godzilla's absence among the causes of my having this interview right now. It's very strange to think about it that way.
Right.
And if you want to be very serious about the salience idea, you might say, no, that doesn't count. Or you can say, oh, it's just another cause, and it's just as good as the rest of them.
Interesting.
Yeah, at a certain level, it seems really weird to magnify or to multiply causes and omissions that way. But then in some cases, it's like it seems like it fits. I don't know.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things about it, and it's one of the appeals to appealing to norms to a certain extent. Because if you're worried about multiplying them and you want to say that they don't cause at all or they don't count at all, then you end up with nothing, and then you have a lot of pretty compelling cases that you want to allow in. So if you go for norms, you can allow in the stuff that you like, and leave out the stuff that you don't like if you're willing to take those norms a little bit more seriously.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, John. Where can listeners go to follow what you're working on?
Thanks, Taylor and Matt. I had a lot of fun talking to you all about omissions. I have a ton of sites. I don't have a website, but the best place to go if you're looking for what I'm up to is look up John Stigall on Phil People.
Nice.
Yeah, we'll make sure to link that in the show notes. And thanks again for joining us. This was really interesting.
Thanks, it was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
In our next episode, we'll talk with Santiago Amaya about whether the expression free will is vague and about how that might affect debates in free will.